Afternoon, everybody. Hi. Thanks for coming back on time from lunch. And for the new people, welcome. So I'm Marni Williams, and I'm the Publications Manager at Power Institute Foundation for Art and Visual Culture at the University of Sydney. I want to begin just by acknowledging that we're gathering here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Power Institute is also on the Gadigal lands, and my research, so I live between Gadigal and Ngunnawal country, so my research has taken place on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands as well. And also the relational nature of First Nations cultural custodianship and environmental stewardship has informed a fair bit of my work as well. So I also want to acknowledge some people in the room who I've had conversations with about that work, people at Power and at Sydney Uni in particular, and also any other First Nations people in the room today as well. So I might just, if we can go to my screen. Thank you. So my background is in print publishing, and it might seem an odd connection to be part of this topic, seeing rhetorics, visualising ideas, but there's a lot of work that I've been up to at Power that hasn't made it out into the world yet. So in some ways, putting together the speakers that I've brought together today, it could be self-serving, but I think it'll be of interest to everyone. I've been having a one-way conversation with their work for a while, so this is a chance to maybe have it come back in multiple directions. So this is an example of just the types of publications Power's been producing. Academic art and visual culture titles in the English language, linear, text-centric form of communication that is the codex, which we're all familiar with. Now, this is another form of academic research communication aesthetic that we're probably well familiar with, and a fairly inaccessible one if you note the price for people who are not part of the institution. So I just use that as an example of some of the questions we've been asking at Power are to do with not just about how to publish in the digital space, but how there are questions of who gets access, but also what knowledge systems are part of that conversation and who gets to be heard. And what I've been working through is also some examples of digital platforms that are already out there. There's lots of good stuff happening, but there's a lot that also replicates the structure, the rhetorical structure of the academic. So the academic obviously has a lot to say, and that's valuable. But even when there's non-linear possibilities, we're pretty much used to thinking about a textual outcome, I think, before we ask a lot of questions. Particularly, obviously, I'm not talking about practice-led research, and there's a lot of artists here who will not, for whom that will not resonate. But in the field of art history and thinking through lots of different humanities projects that I've been a part of, I've been wanting to think about a different kind of approach. So something that Power's been working on, and it is part of a PhD that I'm doing at the Australian National University, is how to have a nodal relational kind of infrastructure for publication that would treat all different media types, all different knowledge systems as equal, so that we can repurpose for different types of interfaces, for different types of audiences. It's not providing the one way in that's led by the academic necessarily. It's thinking about the communities that are engaged, the cultures that are engaged, the objects, non-human perspectives, and thinking about multiple ways into a project. So because this is really just background, obviously I'm talking about myself a lot in this panel so far, but I wanted to give a bit of context because the three speakers that I've invited actually, there's a connection between what they're doing and what I've been thinking through. Because, so this is an example of a site-specific project, and we've created a system that allows you to pin projects of all different types of media to a map, and you can disrupt the map interface with different layers. So you don't have to, so say there's sacred sites involved or things that are not mapped by the geopolitical map box version of the world. And lots of story mapping and things. So that's just an example of some things we're doing. And this is a work I'm doing with a women's artist collective. We started off by creating a visualisation of their history with them as a Miro board and part of an exhibition. So it's actually art making first, before thinking about an academic anthology. This is what the interface looks like at the moment. These are works in progress. But basically, this is the relations that formed in that project have been about the collective of women and how they are a collective. So it's the relations themselves. So where the other one was the relations to the site and the space, this one's about relations between people, events, archives, materials. So thinking about those things, and then some things like distanced views that digital humanities has now given us a lot of access to things. And this is sort of connects to work that both Kylie Bolton and Nick Evershed, who I'll introduce in a minute, are doing in different spheres. Now it's become part of research communication in quite a significant way. But from my perspective as a publisher, we're not thinking much about those interfaces and how they communicate so much, or they're sort of tools for thinking with, but not necessarily for communicating outwards with. So a lot of the work of the people today will be talking, so they've come from questions about audience and the interface from the start. This is the last piece of work that I just wanted to throw out there, which is trying to work with the idea of research being part, those nodes, part of a network, and having images that can be annotated with different layers of interpretation, and that this can be a form of micro-publishing that gets embedded within different institutional websites or non-institutional websites with different layers of access for perhaps cultural safety reasons and things. So there's questions I'm working through here. There's lots of, so I'm not a web developer and I'm not a graphic designer, so, my background is as an editor. So in thinking through how to approach this, I was really fortunate that I've been working for an art and visual culture focused foundation because artists have been doing things like data visualizations as a very poorly rendered Judy Watson Massacre Map, an artwork that she's been working on, which connects to some research projects at Newcastle and also work that Nick will talk about today in The Guardian. So I was starting to look through how research infrastructure connects to storytelling in various ways, and I think we've got some really interesting examples going on. And I'll just, this is one of Ben Gross's works, and I just put this one up, which is about, it's a textbook, it's Facebook without any images included, just because what I wanted to point out was the, I guess, what Mark was saying earlier about just the barrage of images and what's left when they're gone, to give a sense of how important it is to think about how we communicate in ways that aren't text. So this is just a point to how images can kind of run wild. It's something that, something can go from being a slacker symbol, the Pepe frog was just a guy on a couch drinking beer in a comic, to then becoming a hate symbol. I think these are the stakes we're playing with. And another one of Ben's works that I just wanted to put this into the context of the conversation, which is really about hypergrowth, and I know you're going to talk about these things, so I won't go on too much. So one thing I'll say just before I introduce everybody is this work, which is from a fair while back now, but this is one of the works that Kylie Bolton produced with SBS Digital. And this was the work that got me thinking in nodes. So I just wanted to put that as a moment of like an anchor point where this has come from. This is about the Cronulla riots, so race riots that happened. Actually, I lived not far from there when this happened in my youth. So it resonated with me, and it was a way to have, it was a media study of the talkback radio and the influence of talkback radio on the events, but with lots of references to cultural phenomena like the importance of the beach in symbols, and also lots of first-person interviews and things. So I just wanted to give a bit of background as to how this connects to what we're doing. But that's enough on my end because everyone else has got wonderful things to go through. So I'm just going to go through each of the speakers, and I'm really hoping that we'll have enough time for conversation at the end. We're going to have a bit of a short presentation from each, and we'll leave questions till after the discussion. So I'll just run through each, I just wanted to give a bit of background on everyone. So this is Kylie Bolton, I'll start with. So work there. Kylie's a filmmaker and producer and a writer, currently writing a manuscript. She's Associate Professor at Edith Cowan University in Media Studies, and she's been the recipient of actually multiple Walkley Awards, a winning filmmaker and producer, and the categories have been Innovation for Ravi and Emma. She's going to take us through that project from 2002, and also for Digital Storytelling for Cronulla Rise. So this has been a particularly pivotal project in my work, but there's been many recognitions for Kylie, and another one has been a New South Wales Literary Award for her 2021 project, Missing, and that's another wonderful immersive work that she'll take us through today. And Kylie spent 8 years in lots of different senior roles at SBS, so has a wealth of experience in talking with different communities. So I'm looking forward to hearing from her. Just have to order myself here. Apologies. Okay, so Ben, up next. I was trying to think about how I would describe what my impression has been of you, looking in the depths of your website. I think you're just a one-person digital art-making powerhouse. there's so much that's been growing over time, but each of it responds in often quite timely ways to particular tensions in our current digital landscape. And Ben's creating interactive experiences, and it includes machines and systems as well. And although it's artwork that's about the cultural, social, and political effects of software, it's also acts of resistance that get right in the mess of that software as well. And I think that there's a description in your bio of your work as creative civil disobedience in the digital age. And I like that idea very much. And Ben's civil disobedience has been at the Centre Pompidou, Barbican Centre, Somerset House, Hebel and Ufa in Berlin, South by Southwest, and Japan Media Arts Festival in Tokyo. So that's a good number of places to take your disobedience. And I think there's a lot that Ben has got experience with in terms of taking this kind of digital work to the mainstream media as well. So hopefully we'll hear a bit about those conversations. And he's also a professor of new media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and also faculty associate at the Bergman Klein Center for Internet Society at Harvard University, and just came back from Denmark, where he was a guest professor in digital design and information studies at Aarhus University. So busy, and we're so lucky to have you here in Sydney. Thanks for coming. Okay, so on to Nick Evershed. Thanks for coming. Nick is Data and Interactives Editor at Guardian Australia. And there's a wealth of data visualisation that Nick's been up to since the very early days of data blog at The Guardian. And it's including not just data analysis and data visualisation, but also programming. And we'll see some innovative interactives from Nick as well. And Nick's time as at The Guardian has also been informed by research experience as a scientist. And I think that speaks a bit to our topic as well of how we analyse what we're looking at, and in perhaps ways that artists and creative practice can learn from scientific methods as well. So I just want to, I'll leave it there, and I'll give everyone else time to speak. And I think we would be starting with Ben. So if I can invite you up. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Australia, so I hope it's not the last. As an artist, I focus on the cultural, social, and political effects of software, thinking about how the engagement-baiting, growth-obsessed, endless profit interfaces of big tech platforms change not only how and what we see of the world, but also what we see and think about ourselves within that world. And for this first example, I'll take us back to 2011, a time when Many were still excited about a relatively new site called Facebook. It was about that time when I started becoming increasingly self-aware of just how obsessed I was becoming with the site's visible metrics. These are the numbers that count likes, shares, comments, how many birthdays you're supposed to respond to today, how many messages there are, how many friends you have, etc. And it was at that time I started to realize that, especially when it came to a typical like, share, comment box, that I was beginning to care more about how many likes I got and how much it was commented on, rather than who liked it or what they said about it. And this led me to wonder how these visible metrics might be changing the ways I act and interact on the platform. And so I made an artwork to investigate this question, and I called it Facebook Demetricator. It was a free and open source browser extension that hid all quantifications on the Facebook interface. And it allowed anyone to experience for themselves what the effects of the numbers might be. And when I first put this work out there in 2012, a lot of people reacted, why? Why would you want to hide this component of social media that seems so essential to how I navigate and understand my experience of this world? But then people started to use it. And they realized, as they used it, not just that it relieved feelings they didn't realize they were having, feelings of competitiveness or compulsiveness or anxiety, but that it showed how the presence of the metrics was changing the way that they scanned the interface, the way they scanned the interface with their eyes. That whether it was the feed or someone's profile or even an ad, that they'd become conditioned to look to the numbers first, to treat the numbers as the primary guide for what to like or who to follow. And in the years since I expanded Demetricator for other platforms, I ended up in multiple legal conflicts with Meta, the corporation, over this work. And it set the stage for more than a decade of artistic experiments to come around social media. And so what I want to do with the next few minutes is just walk you through a selection of these works, pieces that illustrate my tactics, showing how I recompose, obfuscate, reduce, and reimagine these platforms, disrupting how their computational logics are changing the ways that we think, how we see, and who we are. So shortly before the US election that brought Trump to power in 2016, this is a time when a lot of Facebook users were clamoring for a don't like button. They had the like button. What they wanted was a don't like button. And instead what they got were reactions. These were the additions to the like button that brought us wow, angry, haha, sad, love, and more recently care. And the idea, as represented by Mark at the time, was to give you better options for expressing yourself. And while reactions may help your friends better understand how you feel, it also begins to build, over time, a more detailed profile about a user's emotional life on Facebook. In other words, reactions make possible a form of emotional surveillance, letting Facebook and anyone else figure out, in the words at that time of Cambridge Analytica's CEO, our hopes and fears. And so in response, in early 2017, I launched a work I called Go Rando. Go Rando is a web browser extension that obfuscates how you feel on Facebook. Every time a user clicks like, Go Rando intercepts that click and instead randomly chooses one of the 7 reactions for you. So you click like and you might get love. Click like, you might get haha. You click like, you might get like. But the idea is that over time, a user will appear to Facebook's algorithms as someone whose feelings are perfectly balanced, as someone who feels angry precisely as much as haha, or sad just as much as love. And so it's injecting noise into the system. It obfuscates how we feel to Facebook, but it also confuses your friends. Perhaps your aunt posts about having twisted her ankle and she's looking for sympathy, You click like and GoRando says, haha. Or maybe your friend gets their dream job and you click like and instead it gives angry. These incongruencies force a previously obscured aspect of the interface into the foreground, which is that we're all reporting how we feel all the time to these platforms, and we feel obligated to do so accurately. In 2019, I decided to turn my focus to who was engineering software in order to better understand how it comes to be the way it is in the first place. And that led me to focus on Mark Zuckerberg as a quintessential CEO in Silicon Valley. Using every one of his publicly available video recorded appearances as an archive from 2004 to 2019, I decided to extract every time he spoke one of three things. Every time he talked about the word more, every time he talked about growth, and every time he uttered a metric like 1 million or 2 billion. And I used these excerpts of the archive to create a video supercut that chronicles Silicon Valley's obsessions with growth over the first 15 years of the social media era. And when I started thinking about this project, I thought, nobody's going to want to watch a 5-8-minute video of Mark talking about more. But I wanted to see it, so I did the work. And I started working on it, and I got to 5 minutes, and I got to 8 minutes, and I got to 10 minutes, and to 20 minutes, and to 30 minutes. And by the time I was done, it was almost 50 minutes long of nothing but those three words. And I think the scale of the project ends up being fitting to its subject. Because it's 50 minutes long, I'm not going to show it to you. But I am going to show you a couple of minutes so you can get a sense of it. The work itself is in temporal order, so it starts when he's 19 in his first appearance in public life in 2004. It ends at the last time he appears at the end of 2018 when he is 34 years old. So if we can have the sound.
Many more, 400, 500, 100,000 for 100 or 200.
To grow it, I mean, there doesn't necessarily have to be more.
Almost a million. More focused on growing really quickly. More than 40%. I think I have like 15,000 pending burn requests. 100 million, 100 billion. Become more open, share more, make themselves more open and share more. A lot more, more. Fastest growing hundreds of millions is more, a lot more, more, 50%, more than 500 million, more than 50%. Half a billion, more, probably a lot more, would grow more and more, sharing more and more, sharing more and more. Billions, a trillion or more. A billion, 500 million, half a billion, or more efficient, more. The first billion, way more, 6 billion. A billion isn't like a magical number. 5 billion, billions more. 1,000 or 100 million. 9,000, 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 or 8,000. 1,000, right? It's 9,000 or 10 million or 100 million or more. 5 billion, 1.5 billion. Focus on the first billion. The first billion, way more, continue growing. And more data, more, but also more money, and more profitable, and then a lot more, multiple times more things. More profit gets more, do more things, more, get more, 100 or more, a billion or more. A billion's kind of an arbitrary number. It's a nice round number, but it's a little arbitrary. Billion. About a billion, 4 billion, more. Not less. More, even more things. And more than 100 grow more than everyone else. More will be more. It's going to be a lot more. 85,000 more followers got more engagement. About 1 million, 100,000. It's grown into more than 1 billion. Can get more engagements. Millions of more than 50 times as much. More because when more, thousands of more. 1 billion, more thousands of more. So you can a lot more than 1 million. We may find more, but we can do more. We will more than double. We'll add more than 250. Share more services to help more thousands of some of the more 100 times or 1,000 times bigger. About millions of more to do. And you can find more than 2 billion giving more. So we've definitely grown about 100 billion times. More than 20 million, more than 80 million grown more. And we've been more tens of thousands of more. We're more 20,000 more focused on more thousands of more and more, a lot more, still more steps give you more, a lot more like feeling more, 1.5 billion more deeply, more 2.5 billion feel more by 50 million, more than 2 billion of more than 2 billion, more 80 million, 4.5 million, many more. It's going to go more, just even more, 2.5 billion.
Thank you. There's more than 20 times that much, which you can see on the website if you're interested. I suggest you do it with a friend, as opposed to just having Mark barking in the corner for 50 minutes long. But I think one of the things that's most important about this video is that Mark has one answer to every question. It's always the same answer, and it's always more. And his unprecedented obsession with more is what led me to eventually wonder, what if a social network wanted less? And so in 2021, I built one and called it Minus. Minus is a finite social network where you get 100 posts for life, where every time you add to the feed, it subtracts from your lifetime total. And then when you get to 0, that's it. You just can't post anymore. The feed is reverse chronological, not algorithmic. Post timestamps are vague, not metric age counts. Nothing is monetized. There's no likes or follows or noisy notifications. And the site's only visible metric counts down, showing how many posts each user has remaining. And so just like life, Minus has limits. It doesn't pretend, like big social platforms like us to do, that everything, including our time and attention, is infinite. And one of the most important things about these kinds of experiments is that they not only change how we see the platforms that we engage with every day, but also how we see and think about ourselves within those platforms, not as endless producers for Silicon Valley, but as the finite beings with limited time and opportunity that we are. Thanks.
Hello again. So Nick and I are going to talk through a selection of his work. Oh, sorry, there. Left a mess for you there. And I did neglect to say also about your Walkley Awards. Got to be fair. Yes. So we'll talk about at least one of your Walkley Award-winning works. I guess, where would you like to start? Do you have a preference?
In terms of an introduction?
No, I mean in terms of the work.
Oh, I'm just going to click this red button.
Oh, you're on that. Okay. Yeah, good.
Can I have audio, please? There we go. Yes, so now I've broken it completely. So this is a piece of work. It's one of my favorites. I love to get to talk about it for a few different reasons. So I'm a journalist. I'm a data journalist. It's a mix of programming, data visualization, graphics, design, writing, even sometimes video and animation. And very rarely do you get a story where you can tell the story by taking the whole of something and then pulling it apart to little pieces and then putting it back together. And this is our piece, I can't even remember when we did it, about poker machines or slot machines, and all about the sort of psychological aspects of gambling and what makes it addictive. And it keeps becoming relevant again. It has extended its life because so many of these features that were pioneered in Las Vegas are now present in social media, as we've just seen, or in gaming. Like, people have passed laws to try and ban sort of like gaming mechanics in games now. And so many mobile games have gaming mechanics. And I don't know if anyone's a fan of shopping platform Temu, but they have the weirdest interface. It's like trying to buy something on eBay, but you have to gamble at the same time. It's astonishing. So anyway, That's
And then it doesn't leave you alone.
it's horrible. Anyway, so that's the background. I'll just give a quick demo. Now the button is blue, and the rewards are variable. So you get a sad noise sometimes. Sometimes you get the happy noise. And then it tells you sort of like the scale of what's been going on, measuring your clicks. And so this is like introducing really basic psychological concepts of like intermittent reward schedules and things like that. And this piece sort of builds on this. It
I
has
think
interviews
you keep
with
trying to convince yourself
former gambling
that
addicts, talking about the sort of emotional response to these mechanics. And then it just keeps building up the poker machine from there. We built a real poker machine in the browser for this. We programmed it, we got all the probabilities correct, so you could actually play it if you really wanted to. And it would work using the same probabilities. We break it down further. We look at each of the reals, the probabilities, the fractions, how they change the size of these to mess with your mind, the distribution, and so on, and so on, and so on. It shows you near misses, unequal probabilities, like here. This size is different to this size. How they move around valuable symbols, like the little money bag, and all this stuff, and then we put it all back together. So the pineapple ruined our streak there, unfortunately. Yeah.
Cool. So this is also one of my favourite works, and I got really stuck in it for a while, even though there were no rewards. So I wanted to know a little bit about the process, because I understand that this work and quite a few of the works that I've been looking at of yours and your teams begin with a research project or a publication of some kind. And just to get a sense of where that often starts and how closely you might be working with the person who's been doing the research, particularly when it comes to decisions around the iconography of gambling or, you know, those kind of visual aspects as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. So we often work in partnership with researchers. That's not normal in journalism. It's more frequent in our work, I suppose, because a lot of these things are either quite technical or they're taking something that exists and then translating it to a different audience. So yeah, with this one, it relied heavily on the work of Natasha Schull, who wrote Addiction by Design, a very, very interesting book about gambling and Las Vegas in general. And it goes into, like, you know, how they design casinos, like the architecture and the decor and all of this stuff, plus the actual design of the slot machines. And then, yes, we worked with researchers, one of whom is actually in the piece talking, to sort of get things right and to make things accurate, of course, but also like to go through the poker machine odds and make sure we programmed it right. So, and then, yeah, I'll talk about this a little bit more as well with some of the other projects, because another one is 100% like working in partnership with a research group as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm guessing the next one that might be. But which one do you want to go to next?
I'll talk about, the three sort of very serious ones.
So some of these works include colonial violence, and there's, particularly with the Nauru files, some graphic descriptions of self-harm and things in there, but we won't be encountering so much of that. But just so if you do look at these works.
Yeah, there won't be any imagery, but a very brief discussion. So this is probably one of the earliest works where we combined investigative journalism with, I suppose, like a real visual and research-orientated approach. In this case, my colleague, Paul Farrell, was leaked a copy of every incident report from the security services at the Nauru detention centre. And this was a huge cache of files and very confronting reading, obviously. And so we all basically sat down, read through every one of them, categorized them, put them in a database, so we could report on it, first and foremost. And that was, you know, a very large piece of work, but it allowed us to do things that you couldn't normally do with stories like this, because we could say then, through our analysis, that you know, minors, as in younger people, were vulnerable to certain types of things in detention centres, categorically, because we had the incident reports. We could say these incidents occurred with minors, and we could show how many, and we could show all of these things that were being reported. So that's from a reporting point of view why it was important to do this, like in the same way that you might do a research project. Visually, we used the database and we showed every incident on the page, and you can, you know, filter and so on. This work really informed work we did later on deaths in custody. Very sort of similar approach, but in this case, a lot of the information was actually already public. It's just that no one had really put it together like this before. So this was largely based on coronial inquest documents, and goes through any death in custody that had a coronial report or a report in the media. And again, many, many documents, lots of reading, create a database, analyze it, and then look at things that could inform our reporting. And one thing that, to this day, still gets me is that we were able to show that there were failures of procedure and in institutions, that these would be more common for Indigenous people than for non-Indigenous people. And to my knowledge, I don't think it's ever been followed up. Like, it was very stark. Anyway, and it was only because we were able to put it all together that we were able to report that. And yeah, again, in terms of the visual depiction, we produced this visual database. We tried very hard to work from a point of view to not reducing these people to statistics, which is difficult in this work. It's always difficult in my line of work, generally. So we introduced a lot of iconography and visual aspects. So every square has a person involved. They are named, but we checked with the family where we could get permission to use photos. We would use photos. Where we couldn't, we commissioned illustrations for use. So you can, I won't go through all of them because some of it's actually very confronting, but that's that one. And then this is sort of like chronological, but all these three projects are sort of related in my mind because they all involve very similar aspects. And then this one was about the frontier wars in Australia and colonial violence and massacres. And this one was like very heavily based on, like basically reproducing a lot of the work from Dr. Lyndall Ryan and Bill Pascoe at the University of Newcastle and their team there. And Lyndall did amazing work on this. And so, I mean, that was actually one of the problems for me, is that they had done such a good job with their map initially and all their presentation of this work that we sort of had to figure out what would we actually add to this beyond just bringing a new audience. And part of this was, I suppose, adding like the ability to find like your own place, so you can search by location in this. And, you know, put in your postcode and see which things occurred in your area. And then also, to a certain extent, again, we would use analysis that we would normally be doing, visual analysis, and very obviously low-level statistics to sort of inform our reporting. So because I did a lot of animation, we were able to show how the massacres moved. They moved with the spread of settlement in Australia. You can see them moving along like the rivers, for example, in Victoria. And then obviously the later ones occur up here because it was settled later, even right up until the 1900s. And I should say, obviously, all of this work is not just me, it's like a huge team, well, not huge, a small team of people at The Guardian and people we collaborate with. Yes, probably stop,
Thank you.
pause there.
Yeah, that's so great. And these works, I'm sure it's fairly obvious, have influenced what I've been thinking through in terms of faceting through information. There's obviously a lot of power in showing the systemic issues that you're speaking to with this work through the visual. Something I was reading that Bill Pascoe said himself was about the problem of objectifying and people not having, I guess, becoming the data. And he suggested that narrative was really important.
Yes.
And I know that there are ways in which you've brought narrative back in, and I know that these works link through to first-person accounts and things. So I wondered if, within that thought about how to bring people's voices back to these histories, particularly with something like frontier violence, where obviously it's the voices have deceased. So how we find new ways to bring contemporary voices to these issues in various ways. So just wonder if you would be able to... I also note that the contrast between... With the Nauru files, it's very clinical language, which obviously it needs to be. But the contrast between that and the first-person accounts, that's where there's also just such richness, because you get that clanging difference.
Yeah.
And also just wanted to note that a media inquiry was considered a critical incident up there with... people with getting serious injuries. So it was very much the Nauru files and the fact that you were able to bring that out into the open when it was so carefully kept back by the government in so many ways. To do that really thoughtfully in this way, because it is a big tranche of very traumatic information. So I guess the question there, back to narrative and how to get that balance between the distanced view, which gives us so much in terms of the systemic, and then bringing the personal in, and who you were informed by that.
Yeah, I mean, these are shown, I guess, out of context. When they were run on the news website, my colleagues produced like a raft of stories to go with them where they spoke to the ancestors of these people, like descendants on both sides of massacres in the places where these happened who still live there today. So it wasn't just historical accounts, it was like actual first-person experiences of, family stories and living in these areas still. So, I mean, that's the number one thing, I suppose, is just balancing out and putting it in context. I'm just thinking we probably don't have time, so we might skip the noisy charts.
In our conversation, we'll come back to fuzz.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd love to speak about your noisy charts.
No worries.
Thanks.
Thanks.
It's nice of you to be here. Sorry, let's get the audio. Hello everybody. I'd like to start as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present and all First Nations people in the room and maybe watching later. Thank you to Marni for inviting me, to Professor Ledbury, to Nick Croggan for doing all the work, and to all of you for being here. I work at Edith Cowan University in WA, where I work with film students and master's students, and they're all visual storytellers. They all want to tell, they're all committing their life or their projections of their life to telling stories. And I guess why I'm here is because I've been working in inclusive storytelling since I did my PhD, when I did my PhD on the ways in which to employ best practice to work with communities to tell stories that are not necessarily mine, but to also work with broadcasters and work within the film language to try and really produce some impact in terms of those stories at the level of the individual and the community, and also wider than that. So I will be talking about the work that, even though I'm working with these students now and we're employing these protocols and practice, working with the Aboriginal performance students, for example, at WAPA, to try and co-create stories with them to tell films, I'll be talking about the work I did at SBS up until 2021 when I left. So I was really lucky at SBS. I have a long history with SBS. I made my first film probably for TV probably almost 20 years ago. And then I worked as a journalist and I was travelling and filing film journalism from all over the place. And then I moved from America to Sydney to work in the building. And I was there for 8 years, and I sort of worked as a producer and executive producer and commissioning editor across interactive storytelling. And I led the team for editorial, working specifically with creative technologists, in particular Matt Smith, but also bringing teams together to tell stories of all different types of shapes and sizes. And fortunately in this work, we were able to create bespoke platforms and bespoke sort of forms for each of the story depending on what the editorial was. So they're always stories telling the story in the editorial alongside telling the story of the technology and the way in which you wanted to tell the story. So I thought, because I can only look at 3, I'll just show you a reel, and I might just talk over that reel a little bit because it's just music, so I can turn that down a bit. So this is Cronulla Riots, an excerpt from Cronulla Riots, the day that shocked the nation that Marni spoke to initially. It was a big wall of content. We broke it up into sections. The Boat is a beautiful interactive graphic novel by Nam Le, the short story by Nam Le, and we worked with Vietnamese-Australian artist Matt Huynh, who's gone on to win the Pulitzer and Emmys. This is a story largely through archive about the events in Tiananmen Square 25 years on. Gari is about the First Nations rejection of the colonial narrative of what was called Fraser Island, but in the Butchulla language is Gari. Larissa Berent wrote this piece for us, amazing, and Miranda Otto voiced it. Fiona Foley, the artist, told the story. I'll talk about this one in a bit more detail. It was a live documentary from the Rohingya refugee camp that we produced over 3 weeks. These are photographs from the camp and live feeds from the camp as best as we could with satellite phones, and worked in tandem with the Rohingya community in Melbourne, in Springvale. It's a beautiful piece made by my colleagues, My Grandmother's Lingo, about the regeneration of language. A long read written by Charlotte Wood, and Zahalka's the artist who did this piece. Missing I'll talk to in more detail. I'll just let you enjoy Tamara Dean's photography. And the last one I'll also talk to, it's an interactive documentary in Southern Dialect Auslan. And they're all SBS projects, all available on the website and on my website too. I thought the first project I'd talk to is Missing. I was in a content divisional, as we called it, at SBS, and I worked alongside the NITV team, the National Indigenous Television Station, the online team there. I worked in their commissioning team as well. And there was a comment that First Nation communities wanted joyous and celebratory content, not just this kind of narrative of deficit that we often hear in mainstream media. And when I saw this story, which is the story of a little girl from 1966 in the Adelaide Hills who survived, and this is a trigger warning, I'm not going to go into detail, but she was abducted, but she survived, and she survived for 40 hours, when the statistics are after a couple of hours, it's very unlikely you're going to find someone alive. But this little 8-year-old girl felt so comfortable in nature and in that environment that she was able to manage and move and find herself. But 200 people in the community, including police and volunteer searchers, couldn't find her. And it was not until the South Australia Police brought in Pitjantjatjara trackers Jimmy James and Daniel Mudu that they were able to find her. So when I saw this story and I saw that Wendy and Jimmy's story needed to be told in a new sort of format, we went ahead and found this, were able to research this work. I might just show you the trailer. We really leaned into the true crime aspect because part of my job at SBS, it's industry, and we're trying to get these these projects out to as many people as possible online on the web, where it's really hard to sort of find your audiences. I'll show you a little 30-second clip.
South Australia Police and volunteers have been dispatched in the search for missing 8-year-old girl Wendy Pfeiffer.
My name is Wendy Jane Pfeiffer. I promise to tell you the truth about everything and not to tell lies at all.
So to tell this story, it was really this huge process of research alongside Deborah Schultz, the great researcher, who's no longer with us, but a brilliant researcher. And you know, first of all, we had to talk to Wendy, and Wendy really didn't want to be found. Wendy was not Wendy Jane Pfeiffer anymore. She didn't want to be found. She didn't want to talk about it. But when we told her that we actually wanted to honour Jimmy James, she was happy to do it in those circumstances. So we had a number of interviews with Wendy, looked at the existing archive. The initial monologue that you heard was from a trial transcript. And so from all of these disparate pieces, I was able to write a script for Wendy. We also tried to try to write Jimmy James's narrative. So from this huge amount of research, it really was spreadsheets and documents and so many interviews with everyone we could find who was still alive from this case, we decided it really was just the story of Wendy and Jimmy. And I did write a 5,000-word long read that's a visual long read that has a lot of assets and artefacts from the interactive documentary. So if you search NITV, Bolton, missing, you'll find it. Because it's a huge story. It's so big that I thought it should be a feature film. Yet we did it as an interactive, and it's really a very beautiful project from the collaborative work that everyone is involved in. This is Thea Annamara Perkins, who some of you may know. She created all of the visual assets to create the character of Jimmy. We also had Trevor Jamison, who's the amazing actor. He's in Storm Boy, amongst many other things. He voiced Jimmy, and he's actually a relative of Jimmy, so it was a really beautiful connection. All of these projects were trying to bring people together to help tell the story. Obviously, they're hugely collaborative works, but when you're telling a story, again, that's not your own, you're trying to find the right people to collaborate with. So in this instance, Thea was the right person to bring into this team, and Trevor was the right person to bring in his team, and we found Jimmy James's nephews, and they were part of the process of writing to bring in this team. And obviously the artefact as well. So, you know, there's so many artefacts that we did find, anything that was possible, but this particular project, you know, it was made at a time that there was the Beaufort children were missing it just before this, so you can imagine that the nation was in sort of a frenzy about the idea of missing children, and so journalists camped outside the Pfeiffer's family farm in Mylor in the Adelaide Hills. But of course they couldn't really interview Wendy. They did a little bit, which is something that they wouldn't necessarily do now, considering of her age. And they interviewed Jimmy, but they didn't interview him in language. And so as you can imagine, it's his second, third, fourth language, English. So we never really heard from Jimmy either. So we just took all the archive that we could, the researchers who had done some audio interviews with Jimmy to create his narrative and talking to his family and the like. So this project was one of those that we were able to bring all these disparate artefacts together to create this amazing piece of work. I'll talk through just a couple more projects too. So She Called Me Red. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video that I'll talk over while we watch this together. So this is a documentary made for Instagram. It was a live documentary made over 3 weeks. It commenced on the 11th of August 2018 via Instagram, ran for 21 days. We did 55 page posts, 96 stories and a mix of art, photos, videos and animation. It was a hugely newsworthy story, of course, because it was a crisis that was happening at the time. We began posting at the peak of monsoon season when daily floods and landslides were threatening 200,000 people in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. And our coverage continued to the 25th of August, the first anniversary of the Myanmar Army's campaign against the Rohingya, and documented daily life and major events in the camp. Christopher Hopkins, who's a journalist that many of you may know, won the Nikon Walkley for his work for this piece. It was, beautiful, beautiful photographs beautiful photographs he took of Eunice, who was the sort of central protagonist of this story, who we met in Springvale, part of the Rohingya community there. At that time, he was on a temporary visa. The community told us that they felt like they were the most hated people in the world. They had nowhere to be. Nobody wanted them. Australia wasn't giving them visas either. Hugely precarious in terms of the ways in which they lived. Eunice would take the work that he could. This here is, again, I work with Matt Quinn, who's this amazing illustrator, just to kind of, bring in different forms of aesthetics. So we kind of like, I always think of this project as a bit of a Trojan horse on Instagram. The reason why we use these Instagram was we were using the technologies that were crucial to the Rohingya and other recent waves of refugees hung in plastic pouches around their necks or tucked into waistbands. Smartphones are among the most precious possessions of people fleeing for their lives. Refugees use IM and social media to maintain fragile connections with the family members they've been separated from. The Belgian photographer Thomas van Hoetra has described the Instagram accounts of refugees as digital breadcrumbs that record not only the horrors of their journeys, but moments that are joyful, triumphant, nostalgic and curious. And we also worked with a local photographer in Bangladesh who was able to take the most incredible, intimate photographs of Eunice's family. So while Eunice didn't have, contact or always direct contact with his family, we were able to share photographs of his family with him. That's Eunice's brother, Jairus, who actually worked with us on the ground there and the refugee camp, as you can see. Working at SBS, we always try to work amongst the different areas of the network. So to sort of complement this Instagram piece, I commissioned another piece, which was Faces of the Rohingya, which was by an artist called Tia Cass, who had this idea, and Michael Green, who's an incredible journalist based in Melbourne, who was also a collaborator on the Instagram documentary. Tia would make these incredible portraits of members of the community. Kabir Ahmed owns the Rohingya Bazaar, which is a 7-day-a-week enterprise where so many of the community would gather in Springvale and Victoria, and his wife, Sitar Begum, who was a cook, who worked in the cafe. At the same time, SBS Radio was able to launch the first Rohingya language radio station, and we combined with them to really kind of, amplify the voice of a community that didn't feel heard at all, and also, make them feel a bit more comfortable in Australia when they start to hear their language on the radio. The last work that I'll talk to about is Ravi and Emma, which was a really an incredible project to work on, an incredibly hard project to work on. I think it took about 3.5 years. It's an interactive documentary that's a love story between Ravi and Emma. Ravi was born deaf and Emma born hearing, and it was their love story. It's sort of a very joyous celebratory account, which is essentially using quite difficult technology in terms of gesture recognition, facial recognition technology in your onboard camera for your desktop, enabling you to try as a user to learn select Auslan signs to activate the documentary. And as the sort of producer of this, it was key to work closely with the deaf community. So Ravi was a huge collaborator. They're based in London at the time, so we hired journalists and we worked with script writers to kind of interview Ravi and Emma in language, which was in sign language for Ravi, and create a script based on that. And when Ravi and Emma were in Australia, we flew them to Sydney and we shot them in a studio, and they were able to kind of talk to their story in their own way. Throughout the course of this project, we'd ask the user to do these signs. So these signs are two-dimensional signs. It's not education. It's not teaching people how to sign. It's far from that. It's an entertaining project that's opening people's eyes, I guess, to this incredible world and this incredible language, getting to know Ravi and Emma in the process. But to actually activate this documentary, you would have to sign Ravi or Emma, and that would enable you to move through either one of their documentaries, either one of their stories, and as you progress, there are a number of rewards. Here you can see some rewards that are given once you are able to sign these particular signs throughout. So this project was really successful. Also overseas, where it won the creative use of technology at the International Documentary Festival Amsterdam. And Ravi gave the thank you speech, but I thought I'll talk to you about it, and you could hear a pin drop. And that's what it's really all about for me in terms of co-creation. You know, that's what it's all about in terms of me. You know, it's at the level of the individual, at the level of the community, and at the level of the wider sphere, as in all of us here. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks everyone for sharing your work and taking us through it. There was such a range of subject matter and a whole spectrum of emotions within all of them. So I think what we'll do, so we've got 25 minutes, so I might just kick off with a question so you can all have a think, but then we might give you enough time to ask your questions after that. So I guess something that I've been thinking about across all of the work is how our idea of measurement and metrics influences the way we approach the relations in the project and the eventual decisions about what gets put forward or what gets edited out, or in the case of particular interfaces, the endlessness of them and their never-endingness. In my work, I started off thinking about the platforms as only being able to be adopted by people if we could quantify their impact and their engagement. And so I was thinking about, okay, well, how do I measure that people's research projects are going to be able to show that this is worth investing in, for want of a better description. So I started off with that in mind, but then I quickly went away from that towards, because I think in our work and in the humanities, there's pressure to be either proving an instrumental value to what you're creating, or whether it's artistic practice or an art history project. I think our grant systems are kind of rewarding problem solving. Or there's, on the other end, the idea of intrinsic value that's to do with excellence and prestige and things. And I know I'm sort of, generalising there, but I was thinking about how, instead of measuring, could we visualise value, and perhaps a different kind of value, which in my thinking through all of these projects and the work I've been thinking about, it comes through the relations that are in the project. So between the materials themselves speaking for themselves, or the people speaking for themselves, but also the user in the audience. So the discombobulation, the intentional play that's going on in your work, Ben, and I think also with like the boat, for example, the boat literally rocks in front of you and you can't kind of see what's going on. And then down to the gambling and the idea of like feeling the addiction. So what sort of ways do you approach success that aren't measurement and metrics and might be more about the relations? And do they inform your rhetorical approaches? That's great.
Everybody seems to look towards me because of metrics. I think it's a fight every day to try to attenuate the shouting that comes at us continuously, to constantly look to the quantity as a way of evaluating and understanding our worth and impact in the world. And I'm no less immune to it, despite making the effects of quantification, visible metrics, and its existence in every aspect of our lives a subject of my work. But I think it requires an intentionality to notice that that's what's happening, and to, in my case, I create work that tries to bring to the foreground the ways in which the reliance on quantity or the preferencing of quantity is put in front of us as the imperative all the time. We evolved as a species. One of the reasons I talk about this with social media and why it's been such an intense focus of mine for so long is that we evolved as a species with a need for self-esteem, with a need to feel valued, whether by ourselves or others. And that need, that innate need, served us well for almost all of human history. And then big tech platforms came along and started putting little numbers on interfaces right next to our name and things we posted. And all of a sudden, our value, how we were valued, was quantified and counted in front of us. And it's just so hard for us to not do that. And so I guess what's my answer? My answer is I don't know. It's, our system, capitalism, the computational logics, the way in which the logics of capitalism and computing are really unified into one logic of valuing the quantity over the qualitative continuously, makes it really hard. And so I think we have to continually put projects out there and try to not obsess over, not build them for their potential success, their potential metric success, and try to be fine when the world doesn't notice them in those ways, and keep going even when that's how it works out.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to reiterate that, because this is a really thorny question for anyone who works in the news media in particular, because you produce things on an often daily basis, and everything is quantified now. You can see how many readers a story had, you can see how long they spent on the page, you can see where they went next, if they were engaged with it, and you can know a lot about those readers as well. And it's not that you always want to chase traffic, because there are more important things now, like trying to convince people to pay you money to keep doing good work. But it's also that sometimes you might have something which you feel is important and it's not being read so well. So you can use these metrics to actually fix that, which is a very good use, which doesn't get discussed very often. And there definitely are projects I have done which I love and thought were very interesting. Like I once made a chart of what it would look like if we abolished daylight saving time in Australia and how it would affect sunlight everywhere, and hugely complicated latitude and longitude calculations, all this sort of thing, figuring out the weird time zone near Broken Hill. And was this worth like the 3,000 people that looked at it? It's hard to say, it took a long time. But to me, this is very important, Daylight saving is actually like a very interesting thing, and from lots of different reasons, physiologically and culturally and all this sort of stuff. So it's not always about the numbers. Sometimes it's just if you find it interesting, and if enough other people find it interesting, then I think you can get away with it.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I just add that I think sentiment is a really good value, a way to judge these projects and these projects' success, and certainly that was one of the metrics that we looked at. And so it's like when Ravi, who's been working on a project with us for 3.5 years, who's put so much into that project, is so happy with that project. That's hugely gratifying, and that makes it successful to me. Similarly, we had an exhibition when we launched the boat, and members of the Vietnamese community were there, and someone who I work with was there, and he said that, because that story is such a seminal story for that diaspora. It's the fall of Saigon in 1975, and so many people have been affected by that in the community in Australia. And so he said to me that he's never talked about that with his dad, for example, and he's looking at all these images, and that story was his story, and that to me was hugely gratifying. So you don't always get the opportunity when you're working in an organisation, because there's lots of metrics at play, but that one for me is a really important one. Or if I'm working with actors and they feel that they've been heard in terms of a co-creation process, that's valuable to me.
Thanks. We'll go to the floor, but I do think, Nick, in terms of value and something you're contributing that I think needs some time, the noisy graph, if you just want to give us a bit of your noisy graph while people put their hands up and ask some questions, because I think this is a bit of work that... It's not a bit of work. Nick's been programming an approach to graphs for people with vision impairment, and I think thinking about seeing from the perspective of people who have limited vision adds a lot to our thinking. But also, it's something you're developing not for a particular story, for example, but as an app it's a piece of infrastructure and a system, and a bit like, so Ben's created Minus, it's sort of going from the individual project or artwork to platforms and infrastructure. So I just thought that might be I just wanted to give it its moment, because I think it's useful in our conversation, because we're talking about visions, and this is about people with a different kind of access to vision and how they understand seeing. So.
Yeah, I'll just play it while you're finding someone who has a question.
The lowest value on the chart is 17.23, and it sounds like. The highest value on the chart is 53.14, and it sounds like. Each note is a year, and the chart goes from 2012 to 2022. Passenger. Light commercial. SUV.
For context, this is just a random chart from a story, which is about Australians are buying more SUVs. Normally, when you come to this, you would have your screen reader, if you're blind, read out the bits of text around the chart. But it's also got like an interactive mode, so you can pass through each value one by one and that sort of thing. That's it.
Thank you. Put you on the spot with it. But it is, I was listening to the drop in Facebook's value through the noisy graph, and I think you chose a trumpet that went...
sad trombone noise.
Sad trombone noise, yeah.
So it's part accessibility tool, part like, multimedia, off-platform sort of thing, yeah.
Great. Okay. Anyone like to ask anything? Yeah. Just if you could wait for the microphone to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All fabulous, interesting stuff. Very creative, imaginative and fun. A question for you, Ben. Is there any evidence that Facebook or any of the other platforms appreciate what you're doing?
Yeah, they... How do I even talk about it? In the earliest days of Demetricator, when I first released it in 2012, I could literally see when it was getting loaded up at cubicles around Facebook. I could see their IP addresses showing up in my logs kind of in groups. dev-1, dev-2, dev-3.facebook.com or whatever it was. So I knew from early on that people there were aware of it. I have heard from a small handful of individuals inside the companies about that I have my fans inside Facebook. But mostly the outward approach has been hostile. So they got my work knocked off the internet in 2016. I was fortunate to have the Electronic Frontier Foundation's help to get it reinstated at the time, pro bono. In 2019, the Instagram came out and said, we just had an idea. Maybe these metrics aren't such a great thing, and maybe we should think about studying their effects. This is like 7 years after I'd been publishing about it, and they knew about it well. And then they spent 2 years testing ideas for kind of minimally hiding metrics. In the middle of that test, they came after me and got Instagram demetricator knocked off the Chrome Web Store. And in 2021, they finally came out and said, yeah, we studied it, and it's not really a big deal. And then Frances Haugen came along and dumped tens of thousands of documents out of the company that revealed that they had been doing their own research, their own secret research on the effects of visible metrics for years, and knew very well that the effects were highly negative, for example, on teen self-esteem. And even with that knowledge at the executive level, Mark said, no, we just keep growing. That's all we do. So some of them, there are individuals there who I think are excited and interested in the work, but in general, the ideology that comes from the top at Meta is what dominates. And to be successful at a company like that, you have to buy into this endless growth approach as that being the only way to do things. So in general, that's my...
So they preach creative destruction, but don't practice it.
I don't even, really I think at the top, the name of the game is just grow as fast and as big as possible. And I mean, Mark came out recently and said this is, when Threads was announced, he said, you know what, I'm gonna literally quote, the quote was, I'll pour enough gasoline on this to get it to 1 billion users. Given the role that social media has played in recent events, it's a wild statement. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thanks for a really interesting session. There's lots of questions floating in people's heads, I imagine. I just wanted to ask Kylie about the work that you've been doing at SBS. All amazing projects, and there seems to be some correlations between some of the other panellists in terms of the methodologies, but particularly around the news with Nick. But thinking about your new role in Western Australia, and how you might, or if you are thinking about this kind of process that you worked on in the past, and how that, because I can see that this is very adaptable for digital humanities. As an art historian, there's a lot of people working in that area, and how some of those skills and the knowledge and the methodologies you've used, but also what Nick is doing, but also Ben, and how that can actually potentially be rolled out in the digital humanities to actually tell very deep and historical stories about our pasts and global pasts and interconnections, because often stories are very localised or not one-dimensional, but narrow, and how those connections across nations and across time, chronological, geographical, can be told through these different methodologies in a digital form.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that it's interesting because when I left SBS, a number of the people I was working with were at universities, people who are really interested in telling stories in engaging ways and trying to generate impact for this really important work and recognising the value of storytelling to bring out this important data and information and stories. So absolutely. I worked with Brenda Croft at the ANU and sort of worked with her to get a team of impact people at the ANU to work on a big project she was working on. I worked worked with Sydney University and the business school, and we're working with Percy Knight, who an old Raiders player who were telling his story. It was brilliant. And certainly at ECU, we're looking at storytelling research and how we can work with all different types of storytelling and work with academics and industry in interesting ways. So yeah, I 100% agree with you. One thing I will say, and I didn't really get to talk about it, is often people might say, we've done all this work and all this research and now we want to tell a visual version of it. And really the optimal way to work is from the ground up. So there may be some research, but it's not necessarily all fixed and finished, but it might be a stage where there's these ideas, and then we bring in creative technologists, and then we bring in maybe documentary filmmakers or different storytellers, and we work together, because then it becomes a research in its own right as well, like a creative arts impact research project. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's plenty of opportunities, and I think more and more people are interested in it. And certainly at ECU, I'm fortunate that I'm in a school of arts and humanities where there's a number of really incredible researchers, all kind of passionate to tell stories. So yeah, we should keep talking. Thank you for the question.
Ben's comment was that data can show clear failure of procedures and some horrible examples of failure of procedures. I'm sort of thinking about the rules our legislature, government makes, and the accessibility to the data to map out the outcomes of those procedures. As journalists, is it there? Is it available? What's being hidden? What's actually can be found and processed through?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's one of the constant struggles between transparency and not transparency in our line of work, I suppose. I would say the answer is no. Like the procedures aren't really there to uncover this stuff all the time. Like in terms of one of the main ways we have of doing this is through freedom of information laws, for example. And at the federal level, there are a number of ways that these laws can be avoided, is the best way of putting it. They can not respond for a while. They can, wait until, for example, there was this thing which is now, I believe, in the courts, and there's been a decision made, and et cetera, et cetera. But there was this thing where if you made a freedom of information request to one minister's office and then they ceased to become the minister, was that still a valid request? And they would interpret that in a certain way, and then other people would contend it, and all this sort of thing would go back and forth. And that's before you even get into the fees that can be charged, which discourage, people who don't have money, because, of course, these aren't just for journalists. This is for everyone. So laws that affect freedom of information actually affect anyone who wants to, do these things. And just trying to think, there was a project where people would make freedom of information requests for detention centre incidents and getting more information on them. And these were just like regular people, readers of news websites who wanted to help out, and they made quite a lot of requests. And I think the department, I'm not sure how many ended up going out in the end, but yeah, it was a big project. I mean, there's a lot more that I could say, but I think I'll just probably leave it there. Thank you for the question.
So this is a question, I think this is a question for Nick. Maybe others want to come in. I've been following the kind of data viz Guardian style for quite a long time. And I guess the question is about style and the sort of persistence of a certain kind of visualisation set of conventions that have been going on for a long time, like a really long time. Not in the Guardian, but just in the kind of like data viz arena. And I just wondered if, that's something that I know you've tried to do lots of different kinds of interactions and work with screen space in different ways and so on, but I just wonder if there are ways in which different sorts of cultural milieu ever kind of impinge on that, and even like around colour and, contrast, and so much work within, I guess, particularly within Black studies about colour and, how that's kind of, produces an outlook on life and so on. I just wonder if there's any ways in which that kind of comes into the journalism context, if you're picking up on that stuff or running with it, or, I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question for me personally, because I've started writing about data viz generally in the industry more recently, and so I have been tracking this a lot more closely more recently. A couple of things. I think in terms of cultural sensitivity or specificity with colour, that's a really interesting one. It's not something that comes up very often, I would say, but it is something that we've looked into. For example, with the Deaths in Custody project, we spoke to people from different language groups and cultural areas, just to make sure, like, the depiction of the illustrations, for example, was not using any colours that would have a significance that we didn't intend. That's one thing. We also did that again recently with a project from our New Zealand team about the erosion of Maori rights in New Zealand, and we had a Maori artist who produced some work for us, and so we then had to take that work and translate it into sort of like a visual explainer with lots of different colours, but then we had to check that the colours weren't being used in the wrong way and all this sort of stuff. So it does inform some of our work, not a lot, I would say. But in terms of chart and graph conventions, it's been really interesting in the last couple of years in particular, because there has been quite a shift in a move away from very carefully, nicely computer-generated charts, for example, done in Illustrator or chart software, to, I guess, a more analog approach even. So some people are now combining art and data visualization. So my colleague in the US, Mona Chalabi, was quite a pioneer in this space. I know other people would have done it before her probably, but I know she's made it definitely quite a thing, and she does it very well. And so that's an interesting thing that's happened more recently, and is certainly something that writers of data viz textbooks in the 1980s would not have enjoyed. But I think it works well, and it might not always work as well as a very straightforward chart, but it works better in other ways. So it helps people connect with it. It helps humanize a story. It might help communicate it because of all of these things in a way that a normal chart wouldn't. And it's also something my colleague Josh Nicholas at The Guardian has also started doing. So he's got an interest in art as well, but he's also a digital journalist, so he's also been producing this sort of work. And I know a lot of Kylie's former team at SBS did a lot of this sort of thing as well, yeah.
Thanks so much. A kind of follow-up question for Nick. I wanted to ask, thinking about the Deaths Inside database, which is, of course, a really fantastic resource for tracking that, devastating statistic. But I wanted to ask about the problem of the data set itself. Here you're limited by using coronial inquest documents, and to think about the way that the data in a coronial inquest document has a tendency to naturalise, say, Indigenous deaths as it has no category for it has no category for murder. It has a set of classifications in the coronial inquest that tend to have the capacity to naturalise those deaths, right? And here I'm thinking about the very important work that legal scholars like Alison Whittaker have done to sort of draw attention to that naturalising operation. I wonder how you are all thinking about that kind of question in relation to visualization. What can't be included, but must necessarily be somehow dealt with in order to the absence in the data set that must necessarily be thought about in relation to, you know, in order to understand that picture more fulsomely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a big issue. It's a similar issue in research as well. I mean, there's a few things there. So I guess to the first part of that question, you can choose to not use their classifications. We'll double check this after, but I believe we did reclassify the death categories to make them more, like, I guess, make more sense to readers. But for example, when we did the Nauru files, they had a category system for, like, you know, the level of severity as well. And I think, as Marni pointed out, some of those severity categories did not really match to what a normal person would understand as being a severe incident, like telling the media about something. That's not a severe incident, but anyway. But in that case, we made a decision just to present it as is, but explain why we had done so. And I mean, that's generally been our approach, is to do one of those two things, but to try and explain in detail why we did it. And that's probably the best we can do, and also obviously collaborate with people, usually academics and other scholars who might work outside of academia, to sort of figure out the best approach. I know with Deaths Inside, we worked with the team at Jumbana and a fair bit on questions like that. So yeah, I mean, it's hard, basically. It's very hard. But it also goes back to the quantification thing we were talking about earlier, because sometimes, like, with these things, if you don't measure it, then it doesn't necessarily show up in certain ways, like political response and all that sort of stuff. So,
I'll give you a chance to respond if you'd like to, but I just want to flag that we are at the end of the session, so hopefully nobody has anything burning. But if you had anything you wanted to add, Ben or Kylie? Otherwise, I just want to thank everybody. It's been wonderful. Thanks, Kylie, Ben, Nick. Thank you, everyone. See you at the next one.